Poor single dad let a strange girl stay for one night, unaware she was a millionaire's daughter, a great love story. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. Before anything else, let me speak a blessing over you. May the same God who gives breath to the morning fill your heart with peace, your soul with strength, and your home with endless love. May your tears turn into joy and your worries into miracles. I miss you, more than words can say. I may be unwell right now, but I'm still here, writing with love, writing through the pain because you matter to me. Though you hear James today, every word comes from my heart, and I want you to know this. I'm not gone. I'm just healing. And I promise you, I will be back. But until then, I need you to hold this family together. Please don't stop halfway. Don't leave the story in the middle. Your full watch means more than views. It's a heartbeat of support, a whisper of love that tells me I'm not alone. Like the video, leave a kind comment and stay with me from the first word to the very last moment. Let this be our bond, unshakable, unstoppable, unbreakable. You've always been my strength, and today I lean on that love more than ever. Now breathe with me, and let the story begin.
The silk of her wedding dress clung to Aurelia's legs as she crouched behind the marble fountain in the Montclair estate's courtyard. 300 guests waited inside the ballroom, champagne glasses raised in anticipation of toasting her engagement to Victor Ashworth, a man whose touch made her skin crawl and whose laugh sounded like grinding glass. The diamond tiara that had belonged to her grandmother felt like a crown of thorns, its weight pressing down on her skull as if trying to force her into submission. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall on the white roses that had cost more than most people's yearly salaries. Aurelia closed her eyes and tried to summon the courage that had been building inside her for months. She could hear her father's voice echoing from the terrace, probably wondering where his investment, because that's all she was to him, had disappeared to during her own engagement party. For 26 years she'd been the perfect daughter, the ideal heiress, molded and shaped to fit her father's vision of what a Montclair should be. But standing here in this designer gown that felt like a costume, about to promise her life to a man who saw her as an acquisition, something inside her finally snapped. "Miss Montclair." The voice belonged to Marcus, her bodyguard, as he rounded the corner. His hand rested on his radio, ready to alert the entire security team. "Your father is looking for you." Aurelia's heart hammered against her ribs. In 30 seconds, Marcus would escort her back inside, where Victor would slip that obscene 10-carat ring onto her finger, while cameras flashed and her future dissolved into nothing more than a business merger with legs. Her eyes fell on Marcus's motorcycle keys, hanging from his belt within arm's reach. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and before Marcus could react, she'd snatched the keys and was running. The motorcycle roared to life beneath her, drowning out Marcus's shouts and the rising storm. Aurelia had learned to ride during her brief rebellion at boarding school, one of the few skills she'd acquired that would prove useful tonight. Security guards scrambled for their vehicles, but she had a head start and knew these winding back roads better than they did. Rain began falling in earnest as she leaned into the curves, her wedding dress streaming behind her like a banner of rebellion. She'd driven these roads during weekend escapes from boarding school, the only freedom she'd ever tasted. The motorcycle began making concerning noises around the same time she realized the fuel gauge showed dangerously low. When the engine finally sputtered and died, she found herself on a dark country road with nothing but farmland stretching in every direction. The rain had become a downpour, soaking through the expensive silk in seconds and making her elaborately styled hair hang in dripping tendrils around her face. Aurelia pushed the motorcycle off the road and tried to take shelter under a large oak tree, but the wind drove the rain sideways, offering little protection. Her wedding shoes, custom Italian leather that cost more than most people's cars, were already ruined, and she could feel blisters forming on her heels. That's when she saw the light. A quarter-mile down a gravel driveway sat a modest building with warm yellow windows glowing against the storm. As she got closer, she could see it was some kind of workshop with Vale Restoration painted on a weathered wooden sign that swayed in the wind. The main doors were closed, but there was a smaller side entrance that looked less intimidating. Aurelia hesitated for only a moment before desperation won over propriety. She was soaked, cold, and had nowhere else to go. The door was unlocked, something that would have horrified the security team, but which now felt like a small miracle. She slipped inside and found herself in what was clearly a furniture restoration workshop. The space smelled of wood polish and something warm she couldn't identify, coffee maybe, or bread. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools she didn't recognize, and pieces of furniture in various stages of repair. A beautiful mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, its surface gleaming as if it had just been finished. Despite the humble surroundings, Aurelia could see that whoever worked here possessed real skill and artistry. She was examining a delicate inlay on an antique chair when the lights suddenly blazed on. "Don't move." The voice was deep and calm, but carried an unmistakable note of authority. Aurelia froze, her hand still extended toward the chair, and slowly turned around. The man standing in the doorway was nothing like the polished executives and socialites who populated her usual world. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt, rolled up to reveal strong forearms marked with small scars, the kind that came from working with your hands. His dark hair was slightly mussed, as if he'd been sleeping, and his green eyes held a wariness that spoke of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. He was holding a baseball bat, though he lowered it slightly when he saw she was clearly not a burglar. "I'm sorry," Aurelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to break in. I was caught in the storm, and I saw your light." He took in her appearance, the soaked wedding dress, the diamond tiara askew on her head, the expensive shoes that were clearly never meant for walking, and his expression shifted from suspicion to concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, setting the bat aside completely. "No, I'm not hurt. Not physically." The words came out before she could stop them, revealing more than she'd intended. Something in her tone seemed to reach him because his posture relaxed entirely. "You're running from something." It wasn't a question, and Aurelia found herself nodding. "Someone, actually. I was supposed to get engaged tonight, but I couldn't do it. So I ran." She gestured helplessly at her ridiculous outfit. "I know how this must look." "It looks like someone who made a brave choice," he said simply, and something in Aurelia's chest loosened at the unexpected kindness in his voice. "I'm Leah," she said, using the shortened version of her middle name. "Leah Morgan. Lysander Vale. Most people call me Ly." He studied her for a moment, and she found herself holding her breath. "You can't stay here. This is just my workshop, but there's an apartment upstairs. It's not much, but it's warm and dry." "I don't have any money to pay you," Aurelia said, hating how the words sounded but knowing she couldn't access any of her accounts without alerting her father to her location. "I'm not asking for money," Lysander said. "You look like someone who's had a rough night. Let's start with getting you out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia. My daughter has some things that might fit you." Daughter. Of course, he had a family. Aurelia felt a stab of disappointment that surprised her with its intensity. "She's 8, Lysander continued, apparently reading her expression. "It's just the two of us. Her mother died when she was born." "I'm sorry," Aurelia said, meaning it. "Come on," he said, heading toward a narrow staircase she hadn't noticed before. "Let's get you warm and dry, and tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As she followed him up the stairs, Aurelia caught her reflection in a darkened window. She looked like a drowned princess from a fairy tale, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she might be walking toward her own story instead of one someone else had written for her. Chapter 2. The Art of Deception. The apartment above Lysander's workshop was nothing like the mansions and penthouses Aurelia had known her entire life, yet it felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever been. The living room was small but comfortable, with a well-worn leather couch facing a brick fireplace where embers still glowed orange. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator in the tiny kitchen, and a basket of laundry sat folded on the dining table, evidence of a real life being lived here, not just displayed. "The bathroom's down the hall," Lysander said, pulling towels from a linen closet. "I'll find you something dry to wear. Wren's clothes will be too small, but I might have an old sweatshirt that'll work." Aurelia accepted the towels gratefully, her teeth chattering despite the warmth of the apartment. In the bathroom, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Her diamond tiara sat crooked on her head, water dripping from its edges onto a $20,000 wedding dress that was probably ruined beyond repair. She carefully removed the tiara and set it on the counter, then struggled with the dress's complicated fastenings until Lysander knocked softly on the door. "I found a shirt and some sweatpants," he said. "They'll be too big, but they're clean and warm." "Thank you," she called back, grateful that he couldn't see her fumbling with hooks and buttons that required two people to manage properly. When she finally emerged wearing his oversized clothes, her hair wrapped in a towel, she found him making coffee in the kitchen. "Better?" he asked, and she nodded, suddenly shy. Without the elaborate dress and jewelry, she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the loose-fitting clothes. "Much better. I can't thank you enough for your kindness." "Don't mention it," Lysander said, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. "You said you were running from someone you were supposed to marry. Did he hurt you?" The concern in his voice was genuine, and Aurelia felt a pang of guilt at the deception she was about to weave. But the truth, that she was the heiress to a billion-dollar empire who'd fled an arranged marriage, would only complicate things. "Not physically," she said carefully. "But the marriage wasn't my choice. My guardian arranged it for business reasons. I'm an orphan," she added, weaving truth with fiction. "My parents died when I was young, and the man who took me in has very specific ideas about my future that don't include my happiness." The story wasn't entirely false. Her mother had died when Aurelia was 12, and emotionally her father had been absent her entire life. Calling him her guardian felt more honest than explaining the complex reality of Maximilian Montclair. "I'm sorry," Lysander said, and she could see he meant it. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "What about you?" Aurelia asked, wanting to shift the focus away from her fictional past. "How long have you lived here?" "About 5 years. Wren and I moved here after—" He paused, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug. "After her mother died. We needed a fresh start, somewhere quiet, where I could work with my hands and she could just be a kid." "What kind of work do you do?" Aurelia asked, though she could see from the workshop below that he was clearly talented. "Furniture restoration, mostly. Some custom pieces when people want something specific. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills, and I get to fix beautiful things instead of throwing them away." Aurelia looked around the apartment with new eyes, noticing details she'd missed before. The dining table was clearly handmade, its surface smooth and gleaming. The bookshelf in the corner had been expertly repaired, and she could see the subtle differences in wood grain where patches had been seamlessly integrated. "You made these pieces yourself," she said, running her fingers along the table's edge. "This is incredible craftsmanship." Lysander looked surprised. "You know something about woodworking?" "A little," Aurelia said, choosing her words carefully. "My guardian collected antiques as investments. I spent years cataloging his collection, learning to research provenance and authenticate pieces. It was one of the few things about my education that I actually enjoyed." This was completely true. Her father's collection was vast and valuable, and she'd been required to understand it as part of her preparation to inherit the family business. Art history had been her escape from business classes and etiquette lessons. "Would you mind if I looked at some of your work tomorrow?" she asked. "I love seeing how old pieces can be brought back to life." "Of course," Lysander said, and she was pleased to see him smile for the first time since they'd met. "Though I should warn you, I have a customer coming to look at a piece I've been working on. I'm not entirely sure about its provenance, and the research is taking longer than I'd hoped." "What kind of piece?" "A writing desk, late 1700s, I think. Beautiful craftsmanship, but there are some details that don't quite match what I'd expect from that period. I'm worried I might be missing something important." Aurelia felt a flutter of excitement. Art authentication was one of her genuine passions, though it was a skill she'd never been allowed to use professionally. Her father had dismissed it as a hobby, insisting she focus on business classes that would make her useful to the family empire. "I'd love to take a look," she said. "Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes can spot things that aren't obvious to experts." They were interrupted by the sound of small feet on stairs, and a moment later a little girl appeared in the doorway. She had Lysander's green eyes but lighter hair that hung in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore pajamas covered in paint splatters and held a worn stuffed rabbit under one arm. "Daddy," she said sleepily. "I heard voices." "Hey, sweetheart," Lysander said, his voice immediately softening. "Come here. I want you to meet someone." The little girl, Wren, Aurelia remembered, approached cautiously, studying the stranger in her father's clothes with curious eyes. "Wren, this is Leah," Lysander said. "She's going to stay with us for a little while. She got caught in the storm tonight." "Are you a princess?" Wren asked suddenly, and Aurelia's heart skipped a beat. "Why would you think that?" she managed to ask. "You have princess hair," Wren said matter-of-factly, "even when it's wet. And you talk like the ladies in my fairy tale books." Aurelia glanced at Lysander, who looked amused rather than suspicious. "I'm definitely not a princess," she said, crouching down to Wren's eye level. "Just someone who got very lost in the rain." "That's okay," Wren said seriously. "Daddy and I are good at helping people who are lost. We helped Mrs. Patterson find her cat last month, and we helped Mr. Joe fix his fence when the storm knocked it down." "That's very kind of you," Aurelia said, charmed despite herself. She'd never spent much time around children, but there was something about Wren's earnest face that made her want to protect the innocence she saw there. "Can I show you my drawings tomorrow?" Wren asked. "I made one of a storm like tonight, but with dragons instead of thunder." "I would love to see your drawings," Aurelia said, meaning it completely. Lysander guided Wren back to bed, and Aurelia could hear him reading softly from what sounded like a fairy tale. The domesticity of it all, the bedtime routine, the gentle murmur of voices, the sense of safety and belonging, made her chest ache with longing for something she'd never known she was missing. When Lysander returned, he found her standing by the window, looking out at the storm that was finally beginning to subside. "You can take my bed," he said. "I'll sleep on the couch." "I couldn't," Aurelia protested. "You've already done so much." "It's no trouble," he insisted. "Besides, something tells me you've had enough uncomfortable nights lately." As she settled into Lysander's bed, surrounded by the scent of cedar and something uniquely him, Aurelia stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she'd been trapped in a life that felt like a beautiful prison. Now she was lying in a stranger's bed, having given a false name, with no clear plan for what came next. But for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. Chapter 3. First Love Incident. The Thunderstorm Confession. Aurelia woke to the sound of rain still pattering against the windows and the rich aroma of coffee drifting up from downstairs. For a moment she forgot where she was, expecting to see the silk canopy of her four-poster bed, and hear Maria, her personal maid, moving quietly around her suite. Instead, she found herself in a modest bedroom with handmade furniture and cheerful yellow curtains that let in the gray morning light. A week had passed since the storm brought her to Lysander's door. 7 days of discovering what it felt like to be wanted for who she was rather than what she represented. The events of that first night came rushing back, the escape, the breakdown, Lysander's unexpected kindness. She could hear voices from the kitchen below, Wren's bright chatter mixing with her father's deeper tones. She dressed quickly in the clothes Lysander had lent her and made her way downstairs, following the sound of laughter. In the kitchen, she found Wren sitting at the small table, carefully drawing with colored pencils, while Lysander packed what looked like a school lunch. "Good morning," Lysander said when he saw her, and she was struck again by how different he was from the men in her usual world. There was no artifice in his smile, no calculation behind his kindness. "Coffee's fresh, and there's bread if you want toast." "Thank you," Aurelia said, accepting the mug he offered. "I hope I didn't impose too much last night." "Not at all," he said. "Actually, I was hoping you might take a look at that writing desk I mentioned. The customer is coming this afternoon, and I could use another opinion on its authenticity." Wren looked up from her drawing. "Are you really good at old things, Miss Leah?" "I know a little bit about antiques," Aurelia said, sitting down beside the little girl. "What are you drawing?" "It's you," Wren said proudly, turning the paper around. The drawing showed a stick figure in a big dress standing in the rain, with what appeared to be a crown on her head. "You looked like a fairy tale princess last night, all sparkly and sad." Aurelia's throat tightened. "It's beautiful, Wren. You're very talented." "Daddy says I get it from my mama," Wren said matter-of-factly. "She was an artist before she died. Want to see her paintings?" Before Aurelia could answer, Wren was leading her to the living room where several canvases hung on the walls. They were lovely, landscapes mostly, painted with a gentle hand and an eye for the beauty in simple things. A sunset over farmland, wildflowers in a meadow, a child's swing hanging from an old oak tree. She was very talented, Aurelia said softly, studying a painting of the workshop below, complete with tools scattered on workbenches and wood shavings on the floor. "She painted that one just before I was born," Lysander said from behind them. "She said she wanted to capture what our life looked like before everything changed." "She would have been proud of what you've built here," Aurelia said, meaning it. "Both of you." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that made Aurelia's pulse quicken. She looked away first, not ready to examine what she was feeling. After Lysander left to take Wren to school, Aurelia made her way down to the workshop. In daylight, she could better appreciate the craftsmanship surrounding her. Every tool had its place, every surface was clean and organized, and the smell of wood polish and linseed oil created an atmosphere of creativity and care. The writing desk sat in the center of the room, and Aurelia approached it with genuine excitement. It was a beautiful piece, mahogany with intricate inlay work and brass fittings that had been lovingly restored. But as she examined it more closely, her art history training kicked in, and she began to notice details that told a story. When Lysander returned an hour later, he found her crouched beside the desk with a magnifying glass, examining the dovetail joints with intense concentration. "Find anything interesting?" he asked. "This is remarkable," Aurelia said, looking up with shining eyes. "Lysander, this isn't just any writing desk. Look at these maker's marks and the way the brass fittings are attached. This is a Gillows piece, probably from around 1780. "Gillows." Lysander looked puzzled. "Robert Gillow was one of the finest furniture makers of the 18th century, Aurelia explained, running her fingers along the desk's edge. His pieces are incredibly rare and valuable. See this construction technique and the way the wood grain runs here? This is definitely his work. How valuable are we talking? Lysander asked slowly. If I'm right, and the provenance can be verified, this could be worth $50,000, maybe more. Lysander sat down heavily on a nearby stool. Are you sure? I'd need to do more research to be completely certain, but yes, I'm fairly confident. Aurelia paused, realizing how her expertise might seem suspicious. My guardian had several Gillows pieces in his collection. I spent a lot of time studying them. Leah, Lysander said quietly, where exactly did you grow up? Before she could answer, thunder rumbled overhead, much louder than the gentle rain they'd been hearing all morning. Within minutes, the storm had intensified, turning the gray day dark and sending sheets of rain against the workshop windows. Looks like another rough one, Lysander said, but Aurelia was barely listening. She was thinking about his question and realizing how difficult it was becoming to maintain her fabricated story. Every lie led to more complications, and she was beginning to understand why her mother had always said that deception was exhausting. By the time they went upstairs for lunch, the storm had become truly violent. The power flickered several times, and when Lysander went to check the generator, Aurelia found herself alone with her thoughts and her growing guilt. When Wren came home from school, she was excited about the storm, but also clearly a little frightened by its intensity. The three of them gathered in the living room as the afternoon grew darker, playing board games by lamplight and trying to ignore the increasingly aggressive weather outside. Tell me a story, Miss Leah, Wren said as they finished a game of checkers. Daddy tells the best stories, but I want to hear one of yours. Aurelia settled back on the couch, and Wren immediately curled up beside her, tucking her feet under Aurelia's legs with the easy trust of a child. The gesture was so natural, so innocent, that it took Aurelia's breath away. Once upon a time, she began, there was a girl who lived in a tower so tall she could see the whole kingdom from her window. Was she trapped? Wren interrupted. She thought she was, Aurelia said carefully. The tower had everything anyone could want. Beautiful clothes, delicious food, servants to meet her every need. But the girl felt empty inside, like she was watching life happen to someone else. As she continued the story, weaving a tale about a girl who discovered that freedom came not from escaping the tower, but from learning to make her own choices, Aurelia became aware that Lysander was watching her intently. The storm raged outside, but inside the small apartment, there was a sense of perfect contentment. And then what happened? Wren asked sleepily. Then the princess realized that the most beautiful castle in the world wasn't worth anything if she was lonely inside it, Aurelia said softly. So she decided to look for a place where she could be truly happy, even if it wasn't as grand as what she'd known before. By the time she finished the story, Wren had fallen asleep with her head in Aurelia's lap. Lysander moved to lift his daughter, but Aurelia shook her head. Let her sleep, she whispered. She's not heavy. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the storm and Wren's gentle breathing. The power had gone out completely now, and the room was lit only by candles Lysander had placed around the room. In the flickering light, Aurelia felt as if she'd stepped into a different world entirely, one where stormy nights meant family closeness instead of echoing through empty halls. Leah, Lysander said quietly, I need to ask you something. Her heart stopped. What? The way you knew about that desk, the way you speak, the way you carry yourself. You're not just someone who studied antiques as a hobby, are you? Aurelia looked down at Wren's sleeping face, so peaceful and trusting. The weight of her deception felt crushing, but she also knew that the truth would shatter this perfect moment. My guardian was very wealthy, she said finally, which was technically true. I was raised in a world of expensive things and formal education, but that life, it wasn't really mine. It never felt real. "And this feels real?" Lysander asked, gesturing to the storm-darkened room, the simple apartment, the sleeping child. "This feels like the most real thing I've ever experienced," Aurelia whispered, and that was the absolute truth. Something shifted in Lysander's eyes, a warmth that made her pulse quicken. "I've never felt this peaceful, not since Sarah died. There's something about you, Leah, something that makes everything feel possible again." "Lysander," she began, but he continued, "I know we just met, and I know you're running from something. But whatever happened before, whatever you're afraid of, you're safe here. We want you to be safe here." The tenderness in his voice, the way he said "we," as if she already belonged to their small family, broke something open in Aurelia's chest. Before she could stop herself, she reached out with her free hand and touched his face. "I've never felt this peaceful either," she admitted. "I didn't even know peace like this existed." Their faces were close now, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his green eyes and count the faint freckles across his nose. When he leaned forward, she met him halfway, and their lips touched in the gentlest possible kiss. It was nothing like the calculating kisses she'd endured from Victor or the other men her father had paraded through her life. This was soft and questioning, full of promise and hope and the kind of tenderness she'd only read about in books. When they broke apart, Wren stirred slightly in her sleep, and they both looked down at her with matching expressions of protective affection. "She likes you," Lysander said softly. "She hasn't taken to anyone this quickly since her mother died." "I like her too," Aurelia said, stroking Wren's hair. "I like both of you. More than I should, probably." "Why more than you should?" "Because I'm lying to you about everything that matters," Aurelia thought. "Because when you find out who I really am, you'll hate me. Because this beautiful, perfect moment is built on a foundation of deception. Because everything good in my life has always been temporary," she said instead. "Maybe this time will be different," Lysander said, and the hope in his voice made her want to cry. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small circle of candlelight, Aurelia allowed herself to believe, just for tonight, that maybe it could be. Chapter 4. Second Love Incident. The dance. 2 weeks had passed since the storm that changed everything, and Aurelia had settled into a rhythm of life she'd never imagined possible. Her days began with helping Wren get ready for school, making breakfast with Lysander in the tiny kitchen where they'd developed an easy dance around each other. He handled the coffee while she managed the pancakes, their movements synchronized like they'd been doing this for years instead of days. The writing desk had indeed sold for $52,000 once its provenance was verified, and Lysander's gratitude had been both touching and overwhelming. He'd tried to give her a percentage of the sale, but she'd refused, claiming she was just happy to help. The truth was, she had more money in her personal accounts than he'd make in 10 years, but she couldn't exactly explain that without revealing everything. Instead, she'd begun quietly contributing in other ways. When Wren mentioned wanting new art supplies for a school project, Aurelia had mysteriously found a set of professional-grade colored pencils at a garage sale. When the refrigerator made concerning noises, she'd somehow located a repair manual and fixed it herself, claiming her guardian had insisted she learn practical skills. Each small deception felt necessary to maintain her cover, but they were also building into a web that made her increasingly anxious. This morning was different, though. Wren had been chattering excitedly about the Harvest Festival that was coming to town over the weekend. It was apparently an annual tradition, complete with craft booths, live music, and dancing under string lights in the town square. "You have to come with us, Miss Leah," Wren said over breakfast, syrup making her words slightly sticky. "Daddy says the whole town comes out, and there's the best funnel cake in the world." "I don't know," Aurelia said, feeling a familiar flutter of anxiety. Public events meant exposure, and exposure meant risk. I might not fit in very well. Of course you'll fit in, Lysander said, refilling her coffee cup. Besides, Wren's been planning your festival outfit for 3 days now. Haven't you, sweetheart? Wren nodded enthusiastically. I picked out one of Daddy's flannels for you, and we can braid your hair so it looks like the other moms. The casual way Wren said moms made Aurelia's throat tight. She'd never thought about being a mother, had never been around children long enough to imagine what that kind of love might feel like. But these past 2 weeks with Wren had awakened something maternal in her that she hadn't known existed. Please come, Lysander added, and something in his voice made her look up. It would mean a lot to both of us. The festival was everything Wren had promised. The town square buzzed with activity. Craft booths, local honey vendors, and the scent of cinnamon and apples. Children ran between the stalls with sticky fingers, and families spread blankets on the grass for picnic dinners. Aurelia kept her head down initially, but gradually relaxed. This was a working community where people cared more about character than connections. Her simple clothes and natural manner helped her blend in completely. Lie. Martha from the diner appeared with a plate of funnel cake. Good to see you brought someone to the festival. Martha, this is Leah, Lysander said. She's been helping me with some antique appraisals. Martha smiled warmly. Any friend of Lie's is welcome here. You picked a good one to settle down with. He's been looking lost since his Sarah passed. Aurelia felt heat rise in her cheeks. It's nice to meet you. You too, honey. Where are you from originally? The question she'd been dreading. Back east, Aurelia said vaguely. But I'm thinking about making this area my permanent home. Smart girl, Martha said with a knowing look. Good men like Lie don't come along every day. As the sun set, the real magic began. String lights illuminated the square, and a local band took the small stage. The music was simple and sweet, folk songs that had couples of all ages moving on to the makeshift dance floor. Wren had found friends her age and was running around with glow sticks, her laughter carrying across the square. Aurelia and Lysander sat on a bench, watching the festivities and sharing kettle corn. Dance with me, Lysander said suddenly as the band began a slow ballad. I don't really know how to dance to this kind of music, Aurelia said, which was partially true. She'd been trained in formal ballroom dancing, but this was something entirely different. More intimate, more real. Neither do I, really, Lysander admitted. But I'd like to try. She took his hand and let him lead her onto the dance floor, where other couples swayed gently to the music. There was no complicated choreography, no formal steps to remember. Lysander simply put his arms around her waist, and she rested her hands on his shoulders, and they moved together like they'd been doing this for years. I never learned to dance like this, Aurelia said softly, her voice barely audible over the music. Like what? Like it doesn't matter if anyone's watching. Like the only thing that matters is the person you're with. Lysander pulled her closer, and she could feel the warmth of his body through his shirt, could smell the scent of sawdust and soap that had become so familiar. Tell me about your life before, he said. The real story, not the careful version you give everyone else. Aurelia's heart skipped. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes when you think no one's looking, you get this expression on your face like you're remembering something that hurt you. And sometimes you say things that don't quite add up, like knowing the exact value of an 18th century writing desk, or the way you instinctively knew how to fix our refrigerator. She was quiet for a long moment, letting the music wash over them while she tried to find words that would be true without being complete. I grew up in a world where everything was beautiful and nothing was real, she said finally. Where people collected art and antiques, not because they loved them, but because they were investments. Where every relationship was a transaction, and every emotion was a weakness. That sounds lonely. It was. I didn't realize how lonely until—" She looked up at him, at his honest face and kind eyes. "Until I found myself in a place where someone might make me pancakes just because they wanted me to have a good morning." "Leah," Lysander said, and the way he said her name made something flutter in her chest. "This is the first time in my life I've felt like I belonged somewhere," she continued. "The first time I felt like myself instead of just playing a role someone else wrote for me." Around them, other couples continued to dance, but Aurelia felt like they were the only two people in the world. The string lights cast everything in a warm glow, and the music seemed to be playing just for them. "I'm falling in love with you," Lysander said quietly, and Aurelia felt her world tilt. "Lysander, I know it's crazy. I know we haven't known each other very long, and I know you're still figuring out what comes next in your life. But I need you to know that whatever you're running from, whatever you're afraid of, it doesn't matter to me. What matters is who you are right here, right now." Tears began to blur her vision. "You don't understand. If you knew the truth about me. Try me." For a moment, Aurelia almost did. The words were right there, ready to spill out. "I'm Aurelia Montclair, daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the country. I've been lying to you about everything. I'm not the simple, honest woman you think I am." But then she looked across the dance floor and saw Wren spinning with a group of other children, her face bright with joy, and she couldn't bear the thought of destroying this perfect moment. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered instead, which was absolutely true even if everything else was complicated. Lysander's smile was radiant. "Yeah? Yeah. With you and with Wren and with this life we've been building together. I've never been happier than I've been these past 2 weeks." He kissed her then, soft and sweet under the string lights, while the band played and families danced around them. It was the kind of kiss that belonged in fairy tales, the kind that made her believe in happy endings, despite everything she knew about the real world. When they broke apart, Wren came running over, breathless and glowing. "Are you kissing?" she asked with 8-year-old directness. "Maybe a little," Lysander said, not letting go of Aurelia's hand. "Good," Wren said seriously. "I was hoping you would. Does this mean Leah is going to stay forever now?" Aurelia's heart clenched. "Would you like that?" "More than anything," Wren said, throwing her arms around both of them. "We could be a real family." Standing there in the circle of their arms, surrounded by the warmth and joy of the festival, Aurelia felt something she'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. It didn't matter that her father was probably mobilizing every resource to find her, or that her real life was waiting to reclaim her. In this moment, under these stars, with these people who loved her, she was home. "I'd like that too," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being, even as a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that it was impossible. But impossible things happened all the time, didn't they? Sometimes princesses really did find their happy endings, even if they looked nothing like what anyone expected. As they walked home through the quiet streets, Wren between them holding both their hands, Aurelia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this fairy tale could have a real ending after all. Chapter 5. Third Love Incident. The fever night. 3 days after the festival, Aurelia woke to the sound of Wren coughing. It was still dark outside, probably around 4 in the morning, and the apartment was quiet except for the concerning wet sound coming from the little girl's room. She slipped out of bed and padded quietly down the hall, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. Wren's door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Aurelia could see Lysander sitting on the edge of his daughter's bed, his hand on her forehead. Even from the doorway, she could see that Wren's face was flushed, and her breathing sounded labored. "How long has she been like this?" Aurelia whispered, stepping into the room. Lysander looked up, and she could see the worry etched in every line of his face. She woke me up about an hour ago. Her fever's climbing and she can't seem to stop coughing. Aurelia moved to the other side of the bed and placed her hand on Wren's forehead. The little girl's skin was burning hot, and she was shivering despite the fever. "Have you called the doctor?" she asked. "Pediatrician's after-hours line," Lysander said, exhaustion clear in his voice. "They said to monitor her temperature and bring her in if it hits 104 or she has trouble breathing." "Then we keep her comfortable until morning," Aurelia said, though she felt out of her depth. She'd never cared for a sick child before, but something instinctive kicked in, the need to help, to do something useful. For the next several hours, they worked together. Lysander handled the medical aspects, while Aurelia focused on comfort, cool washcloths, quiet stories, small sips of water. Her presence seemed to calm Wren, and that gave Lysander the support he needed. "I don't feel good, Daddy," Wren whispered during one of her brief lucid moments, her small hand reaching for her father. "I know, sweetheart," Lysander said, his voice thick with emotion. "But Leah and I are here, and we're going to take care of you until you feel better." "Leah?" Wren's fever-bright eyes found Aurelia in the dim light. "Will you stay with me?" "Of course," Aurelia said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I'm not going anywhere." And she meant it. Nothing in her privileged upbringing had prepared her for this kind of vigil, this bone-deep worry for another person's well-being. When she'd been sick as a child, professional nurses had cared for her while her father continued his business activities and her mother maintained her social calendar. The idea that parents might stay up all night, personally monitoring every breath and temperature spike, was completely foreign to her experience. But here, in this small bedroom with its hand-painted murals and stuffed animals, she discovered something she'd never known existed: the fierce, protective love that made someone willing to sacrifice anything for a child's comfort. As dawn broke, Wren's breathing became less labored, though her fever remained high. Aurelia continued to monitor her carefully, while Lysander dozed fitfully in the chair by the window, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion after hours of worry. The vigil had shown Aurelia something she'd never experienced: the fierce, protective devotion that made someone willing to sacrifice anything for a child's well-being. Around mid-morning, Wren's fever finally began to drop. Her sleep became more peaceful, and the flush faded from her cheeks. The question hit Aurelia like a physical blow. Wren's fevered, innocent eyes were fixed on her face, waiting for an answer that Aurelia didn't know how to give. "What makes you ask that?" she said gently. "Because you stayed with me all night, like mamas do. And because Daddy looks at you the way he looks at mama's pictures, like you're the most beautiful thing in the world." Aurelia felt tears prick at her eyes. "Your daddy and I care about each other very much," she said carefully. "And I care about you more than I ever thought possible. But you're not going to leave, are you? Like Mama did?" The faith in Wren's voice, the absolute trust that Aurelia would give her the truth, was devastating. Because the truth was that she wanted nothing more than to stay, to be Wren's mother in all the ways that mattered, to build a life with Lysander that was based on love instead of obligation. But the truth was also that her real world was still out there, waiting to reclaim her. Her father wouldn't give up looking, and eventually her deception would be discovered. When that happened, this beautiful, fragile thing they'd built would shatter, and she would be the one responsible for breaking Wren's heart. "I'm going to be here as long as I possibly can," she said finally, which was the most honest answer she could give. "Promise." "I promise I'll never leave you by choice," Aurelia said, and meant it completely. By mid-morning, Wren's fever had broken completely, and she was sleeping peacefully. Lysander had finally allowed Aurelia to convince him to get some real rest, and she'd taken over the vigil, sitting in the chair beside the bed with a book in her lap that she wasn't really reading. The events of the night had shaken something loose inside her, some fundamental understanding about what love really meant. She'd spent her entire life surrounded by people who claimed to care about her, but their concern had always been conditional, based on her usefulness to their plans, her ability to enhance their social standing, her willingness to comply with their expectations. But this, sitting through the dark hours of the night, cooling a feverish forehead, offering comfort without expecting anything in return, this was love in its purest form, and she'd discovered that she was capable of it, that somewhere beneath the carefully constructed exterior of the perfect heiress was a woman who could nurture and protect and sacrifice. "How is she?" Lysander's voice was soft as he appeared in the doorway, his hair mussed from sleep. "Much better," Aurelia said. "Her fever's been normal for the past 2 hours, and she's breathing easier." He moved to the bed and placed his hand on Wren's forehead, relief washing over his features when he felt the cool skin. "Thank you," he said, looking at Aurelia with an expression that made her heart race. "I don't know what I would have done without you last night." "You would have done exactly what you always do," Aurelia said. "You would have taken perfect care of her, because that's who you are." "No," Lysander said, shaking his head. "I've done this alone before. When she was sick after Sarah died, it was terrifying, and I felt so helpless. But last night, having you here, having someone who cared about her as much as I do, it made all the difference." He sat down on the bed beside his sleeping daughter, and Aurelia could see the emotion he was trying to keep in check. "Leah," he said quietly, "what we have, what we're building together, it's not just about you and me anymore. Wren loves you. She's already thinking of you as her mother." "I know," Aurelia whispered. "She asked me about it this morning." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that I care about both of you more than I ever thought possible." Lysander reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I need you to know that I've never felt this way about anyone except Sarah. And even that was different. We were kids when we fell in love, and we grew up together. With you, it's like I'm discovering parts of myself I didn't know existed." Aurelia's throat was tight. "Lysander, I know you're still figuring things out, and I don't want to pressure you, but watching you with Wren last night, seeing how naturally you've become part of our family, I can't imagine our lives without you anymore." The weight of his words, the love and hope in his voice, was almost unbearable, because she couldn't imagine her life without them either. But she also couldn't see how to bridge the gap between the woman she was with them and the reality of who she actually was. "I can't imagine my life without you either," she said, which was the absolute truth. "Then stay," he said simply. "Whatever you're running from, whatever you're afraid of, we'll face it together. You don't have to carry your burdens alone anymore. If only it were that simple. If only love could really conquer the complications of her real identity, the demands of her father's world, the impossible gulf between Aurelia Montclair and Leah Morgan." "I want to," she said. "You have no idea how much I want to." Lysander leaned forward and kissed her, soft and gentle and full of promise. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Then we'll figure out how to make it work," he said. "Whatever it takes." At that moment, Wren stirred in her sleep, a small smile crossing her face as if she were having a pleasant dream. Watching her, Aurelia felt the full weight of what she stood to lose if her deception was discovered, but also the full weight of what she could gain if she found a way to make this life real. For the first time since fleeing her engagement party, she began to seriously consider what it would take to stay. Not just as Leah Morgan, the mysterious woman who'd appeared in their lives, but as herself. The real question was whether Lysander could love Aurelia Montclair as much as he loved Leah Morgan, and whether the truth would set her free or destroy everything she'd come to cherish. As the afternoon sun streamed through Wren's bedroom window, illuminating the little family they'd somehow become, Aurelia made a decision. She would find a way to tell them the truth. Not today, while Wren was still recovering, but soon. Because this love was too precious to build on a foundation of lies, and these people deserved to know who they were really choosing to let into their hearts. The question was whether they would still want her when they knew. Chapter 6. Fourth Love Incident. The Proposal. 2 months had passed since Wren's fever, and autumn had settled over the countryside like a comfortable blanket. The leaves on the oak tree outside Lysander's workshop had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and there was a crisp edge to the morning air that made everything feel fresh and full of possibility. Aurelia had fallen completely into the rhythm of their life together. She helped with Wren's homework each afternoon, taught her to braid friendship bracelets and paint watercolor landscapes. In the evenings, she and Lysander worked side by side in the workshop, her growing knowledge of antiques proving invaluable to his business. She'd even started contributing to their household expenses with money she claimed came from selling jewelry she'd inherited. Another carefully constructed lie that made her stomach churn with guilt. But the guilt was becoming harder to ignore, especially when she saw how completely Lysander and Wren had accepted her into their family. Wren had started calling her Mama Leah without any prompting, and Lysander had begun making casual references to their future together. Plans for next summer's garden, ideas for expanding the workshop, dreams of the life they would build. This morning, Lysander seemed different. There was an energy about him, a barely contained excitement that reminded Aurelia of a child with a secret. He'd been humming while he made breakfast, and she'd caught him staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "In a good mood today," she observed as they watched Wren catch the school bus from the kitchen window. "I have something I want to show you later," he said, his arms coming around her waist from behind. "After Wren gets home." "What kind of something?" "The kind that requires patience," he said, pressing a kiss to the side of her neck that made her shiver. The day passed with unusual slowness. Aurelia tried to focus on the antique secretary desk they were restoring, but she found herself watching Lysander whenever she thought he wasn't looking. There was definitely something different about him, something that made her pulse quicken with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. When Wren returned from school, she seemed to be in on whatever secret Lysander was keeping. She kept shooting conspiratorial glances at her father and giggling when she thought Aurelia wasn't paying attention. "Are you two plotting something?" Aurelia asked as they shared an early dinner. "Maybe," Wren said, with 8-year-old mischief sparkling in her eyes. "But it's a good plot. The best kind of plot. A plot that requires a walk after dinner," Lysander added, "if you're up for it." Their usual evening walk took them along a path that wound through the woods behind the workshop, eventually emerging at a small clearing where an old stone bench sat beneath a massive willow tree. It was Aurelia's favorite spot on the property, peaceful and hidden from the world, where she could almost forget about the complications waiting for her in her real life. Tonight, however, the clearing looked different. Someone had strung tiny white lights through the willow's drooping branches, creating a canopy of stars that reflected the ones beginning to appear in the darkening sky. A bouquet of wildflowers sat on the stone bench, and soft music drifted from a small speaker hidden among the roots. "Lysander," Aurelia breathed, her hand flying to her throat. "What is this?" "This," he said, taking her hands in his, "is me trying to create a moment worthy of the most important question I've ever asked." Her heart stopped. She knew what was coming, had probably known for weeks, but the reality of it still hit her like a physical blow. This was everything she wanted and everything she couldn't have, wrapped together in the most beautiful gesture anyone had ever made for her. "Leah," Lysander continued, and she could hear the nervousness in his voice now, see the way his hands trembled slightly as he held hers. "These past few months with you have been the happiest of my life since Sarah died. Actually, if I'm being completely honest, They've been different from what I had with Sarah. Not better or worse, just more complete somehow. Wren had positioned herself on a fallen log a few feet away, her chin propped on her hands as she watched the proceedings with rapt attention. "You've brought something into our lives that I didn't even know we were missing," Lysander went on. "You've made Wren laugh in ways she hasn't since she was very small, and you've made me remember what it feels like to hope for the future again." Tears were already blurring Aurelia's vision. "Lysander, please." "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know you're still healing from whatever happened in your past. I know you're still figuring out who you want to be and where you want your life to go. But I need you to know that wherever you decide to go, I want to be there with you. And more than that, I want you to know that you already have a home here, with us, for as long as you want it." He released her hands and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that made Aurelia's breath catch in her throat. "This was my grandmother's ring," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple but beautiful diamond solitaire set in white gold. "She wore it for 63 years, and my grandfather always said it was the smartest investment he ever made because it bought him a lifetime with the woman he loved." "Oh, Lysander," Aurelia whispered, the tears falling freely now. "Leah Morgan," he said, dropping to one knee in front of her, "will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and making you laugh and building something beautiful together?" The ring sparkled in the fairy lights, but it was nothing compared to the light in Lysander's eyes as he looked up at her with such hope and love that it physically hurt to see. This was the moment she'd been dreaming of without realizing it. The fairy tale ending that every girl imagined but so few ever found. And she couldn't say yes. "Lysander," she began, her voice breaking. "Say yes, Mama Leah," Wren called out, bouncing on her log with excitement. "Say yes so we can be a real family." The word family hit Aurelia like a dagger to the heart, because that's what they were, what they'd been for months now. Not because of shared blood or legal documents, but because of love and choice and the thousand small moments that had woven their lives together. Wren was already her daughter in every way that mattered, and Lysander was already her partner, her other half, the person she wanted to build a life with. But built on what foundation? How could she say yes when he didn't even know her real name? "I want to," she said, her voice barely audible. "You have no idea how much I want to." "Then say yes," Lysander said simply. "Whatever's holding you back, whatever you're afraid of, we'll face it together." "You don't understand," Aurelia said, wrapping her arms around herself. "There are things about me, about my past, that you don't know. Things that would change how you feel about me." "Try me," he said, rising to his feet but keeping the ring box open between them. "I told you before that your past doesn't matter to me. I meant it. What if my past won't stay in the past? What if it comes looking for me and destroys everything we've built?" "Then we'll deal with it when it happens," Lysander said. "But I'm not going to let fear of what might happen keep me from fighting for what I know is right." Before Aurelia could respond, the distant sound of car engines reached them through the trees. Multiple engines moving fast and getting closer. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. She'd been careful, paying with cash, avoiding cameras, staying off social media. But 3 months was a long time to stay hidden from someone with Maximilian Montclair's resources. Perhaps a store security camera had caught her face, or a facial recognition system had flagged her at a gas station. However they'd found her, it was over. "Lysander," she said urgently, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. In about 30 seconds, some very serious men in very expensive suits are going to come through those trees, and they're going to want to take me away." "What?" Lysander's face shifted from confusion to alarm. "Leah, what are you talking about?" The first black SUV broke through the tree line, followed immediately by 2 others. They moved with military precision, surrounding the clearing before their occupants even emerged. Men in dark suits stepped out, followed by the one person Aurelia had hoped never to see again. Her father. Maximilian Montclair looked exactly as she remembered, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of cold authority that came from never having been told no. His eyes swept the clearing, taking in the fairy lights, the ring box still clutched in Lysander's frozen hand, and finally settling on his daughter with an expression of profound disappointment. "Aurelia," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Enough of this nonsense. It's time to come home." The name hit Lysander like a physical blow. She could see the moment understanding dawned in his eyes, followed immediately by betrayal so deep it made her want to disappear into the earth. "Aurelia," he repeated, the word barely a whisper. "Miss Montclair," one of the security men said, stepping forward. "Your father has been very worried about you." "Daddy." Wren's voice was small and confused. "What's happening? Why are they calling Mama Leah a different name?" The innocence in Wren's question was devastating. This little girl who had opened her heart so completely, who had trusted so absolutely, was about to learn that the woman she'd come to think of as her mother was nothing but a lie. "I can explain," Aurelia said desperately, turning back to Lysander. "I wanted to tell you. I was going to tell you." "Tell me what?" Lysander's voice was hollow. "That your name isn't Leah, that you're not some artist running from a bad relationship. What else have you been lying about?" "Everything," Maximilian said before Aurelia could answer. "My daughter is Aurelia Montclair, heiress to Montclair Industries. She disappeared from her engagement party 3 months ago, leaving her fiancé and 300 guests waiting." "Engagement party?" Lysander looked like someone had struck him. "You're engaged?" "Was engaged," Aurelia said quickly. "That's what I was running from. That's why I left." "And decided to play house with the first fool you found." Maximilian's voice was cutting. "Really, Aurelia, I expected better judgment from you." "Don't you dare talk about them like that," Aurelia snapped, finding her voice for the first time since the cars arrived. "These people are worth more than anyone in your entire world." "These people are nothing," Maximilian said dismissively. "And this little fantasy of yours is over. Victor is waiting. The wedding arrangements have been rescheduled, and you will come home now." "No," Aurelia said, surprising everyone, including herself. "I won't." "You will," Maximilian said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Because Mr. Vale's business operates on very slim margins, doesn't it? A few strategic lawsuits, some questions about his licensing, complaints to the Better Business Bureau, small problems that can snowball quickly for a one-man operation." He paused, his cold gaze shifting to Wren. "And children need stable homes. Social services takes a dim view of single fathers who can't provide adequate supervision, especially when anonymous tips suggest concerning behavior." The threats were delivered conversationally, but their meaning was crystal clear. Even if she could find a way to reach out to Lysander and Wren, her very presence in their lives would put them in danger. Aurelia looked at Lysander's stricken face, at Wren's confused and frightened expression, and felt her world collapse completely. "You have 30 seconds to make your choice, Aurelia," Maximilian said, checking his expensive watch. "Come willingly, or watch me destroy everything these people hold dear." The ring box fell from Lysander's numb fingers, landing in the grass with a soft thud that sounded like the death of every dream she'd ever had. Chapter 7. The Shattered Truth. The silence in the clearing stretched like a physical thing, broken only by the soft sound of Wren beginning to cry. Aurelia's heart shattered at the sound, but she forced herself to remain standing as Maximilian's ultimatum hung in the air between them. "Daddy," Wren said through her tears, tugging on Lysander's shirt. I don't understand what's happening. Why won't Mama Leah answer me? Lysander looked down at his daughter, then back at Aurelia. His face cycled through confusion, hurt, and something that might have been understanding. Aurelia Montclair, he said slowly, testing the name. The heiress who disappeared 3 months ago. I saw it on the news. You knew, she whispered. I suspected something when you identified that desk so quickly, but I told myself it didn't matter. His voice was quiet, controlled. I was wrong, wasn't it? It matters a lot. Not in the way you think, Aurelia said desperately. Everything between us was real. My feelings, the way I am with Wren. But built on a lie, he said simply. You've been lying to us for months. To Wren, who calls you Mama. Enough, Maximilian interrupted. Aurelia, you have 15 seconds to make your decision. Lysander bent down and picked up the ring box from where it had fallen, closing it with a soft click that sounded final. You don't need 15 seconds, he said, his voice eerily calm. The decision's already been made for you, hasn't it? It was made the moment you decided we weren't worth the truth. That's not fair, Aurelia said, tears streaming down her face. You don't understand the impossible position I was in. I understand that I asked you to marry me, and you've been lying to me about who you are from the moment we met, Lysander said. I understand that my daughter has been calling you Mama, while you've been pretending to be someone you're not. I never pretended about loving her, Aurelia said fiercely, or about loving you. How can I believe anything you say now? Lysander's voice cracked slightly. How can I trust that any of it was real when you couldn't even tell me your real name? One of Maximilian's security men stepped forward. Sir, we really need to move. The longer we stay here, the more complicated this becomes. Daddy, Wren said again, her voice smaller now. Is Mama Leah really leaving us? The question hung in the air like a knife to Aurelia's heart. She looked at this little girl who had become her daughter in every way that mattered, who had trusted her completely and unconditionally, and realized that there was no way to explain this that wouldn't devastate her. Wren, Aurelia said, kneeling down so they were at eye level. I need you to listen to me very carefully, okay? Wren nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Why did those men call you a different name? Are you in trouble? It's complicated, sweetheart, Aurelia said, her voice breaking. Sometimes adults have to use different names when they're trying to stay safe, but I should have told you and your daddy the truth sooner. Are you really not Mama Leah? Wren's voice was so small it broke Aurelia's heart. I am still the same person who read you stories and helped with your homework, Aurelia said gently. My name is different, but everything else about who I am with you, that's all still true. But you're leaving, Wren said, not really a question. Aurelia glanced at her father's cold face, at the security men waiting to escort her away, at Lysander's expression of profound betrayal. I have to, she whispered. But that doesn't mean I don't love you. That doesn't mean you're not the most important little girl in the world to me. Time's up, Maximilian said. Aurelia, come with us now or I start making phone calls. Aurelia stood slowly, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. She looked at Lysander one last time, memorizing his face, the way the fairy lights caught the gold in his hair, the workshop clothes that smelled like sawdust and home. I'm sorry, she said. I'm so sorry for all of it. But please don't doubt that what we had was real. Please don't let this destroy the memory of what we built together. What we built together was based on a lie, Lysander said flatly. Maybe it felt real to you, but it was never real for me because I was in love with someone who doesn't exist. The words hit her like physical blows, but she couldn't argue with them. Leah Morgan, the woman who made pancakes and fixed refrigerators and fell asleep reading bedtime stories, that woman was a creation, a role she'd played. Aurelia Montclair was someone else entirely, someone who lived in a world of obligations and expectations that had no room for small apartments above woodworking shops. "Goodbye, Lysander," she said softly. "Goodbye, Wren." She turned toward the SUVs before she could lose her nerve, but Wren's voice stopped her. "Wait," the little girl called out, running toward her. She pressed something into Aurelia's hand, a small drawing folded multiple times. "I made this for you yesterday. It's our family." Aurelia opened the paper with trembling fingers. The drawing showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a small house, a tall figure labeled Daddy, a smaller one labeled Wren, and a third labeled Mama Lie, with yellow hair and a big smile. At the top, in Wren's careful printing, were the words, "My family." The sight of it broke something fundamental inside Aurelia. She knelt down and pulled Wren into her arms, holding her tight and breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the lingering smell of the art supplies she'd been using earlier. "I love you, little star," she whispered, using the pet name that had developed naturally between them. "I will always, always love you." "I love you too, Mama Lia," Wren whispered back. "Will you come back?" Aurelia couldn't answer that question, not when she didn't know the answer herself. Instead, she kissed the top of Wren's head and gently disentangled herself from small arms that tried to hold on. As she walked toward the waiting vehicles, she could hear Wren crying harder now, calling for her to come back, and the sound nearly brought her to her knees. She forced herself not to look back, knowing that if she saw Lysander comforting his daughter who was crying because of choices Aurelia had made, she might not be able to keep walking. The interior of the SUV was leather and silence. Maximilian settled beside her while security men took the front seats, and within moments they were driving away from the clearing, away from the fairy lights and the fallen ring box and the 2 people who had become her entire world. "Really, Aurelia," Maximilian said as they reached the main road, "I expected this sort of romantic nonsense when you were a teenager, but at 26, it's quite beneath you." "Don't," Aurelia said quietly, still clutching Wren's drawing. "Don't what?" "Point out that you've been playing an extended game of make-believe? That you've wasted 3 months of your life pretending to be some common person when you have responsibilities." "Don't act like what I found there was worthless," Aurelia said, her voice gaining strength. "Those people love each other. They've built something real and beautiful and honest." "They've built a fantasy," Maximilian corrected, "and now it's over. Victor has been remarkably patient about this whole episode, but his patience has limits. The wedding is rescheduled for next month. I won't marry him." "You will," Maximilian said with absolute certainty. "Because after tonight's little scene, you've burned your bridges with your woodland friends quite thoroughly. That man will never trust you again, and the child will learn to forget you eventually. Children are resilient that way." The casual cruelty in his voice made Aurelia want to scream, but she also knew he was right about Lysander. The look in his eyes when he'd learned her real name, the flat certainty in his voice when he'd said their relationship was based on a lie. That wasn't something that could be easily forgiven or forgotten. "You have a week to get yourself together," Maximilian continued, "to remember who you are and what your obligations are. Then we'll announce your engagement to Victor, and this unfortunate chapter will be closed permanently." Aurelia stared out the window at the countryside passing by, at the small towns and farms where people lived simple, honest lives. Somewhere behind them, Lysander was probably trying to explain to Wren why the woman she'd called Mama had really been someone else entirely. Somewhere behind them, a little girl was learning that even the people you love most can lie to you in ways that change everything. The weight of what she'd done, what she'd destroyed, settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. She told herself that the deception was necessary, that it was protecting everyone involved. But really, she'd been protecting herself. from rejection, from having to choose between two worlds, from the possibility that love might not be enough to bridge the gap between who she was and who she wanted to be. Now she knew the answer to that question. Love wasn't enough. Not when it was built on lies. Not when the truth could destroy everything you'd tried to protect. As the miles passed and they drew closer to the world she'd tried to escape, Aurelia folded Wren's drawing carefully and placed it in her pocket, close to her heart. It was all she had left of the life she'd tried to build, the family she'd tried to become part of, the woman she'd tried to be. For 3 months, she'd been Leah Morgan, someone who belonged somewhere, someone who was needed and wanted and loved. Now she was Aurelia Montclair again, and she'd never felt more lost in her life. The SUV pulled through the gates of the Montclair estate, and Aurelia looked up at the mansion that had never felt like home. In a few hours, she would be back in her silk sheets and designer clothes, surrounded by luxury and emptiness. In a few weeks, she would walk down an aisle toward a man she didn't love, sealing a future that felt like a beautiful prison. But tonight, for just a little while longer, she would hold on to Wren's drawing and remember what it felt like to be part of a real family, even if it had all been built on the shifting foundation of her own desperate lies. Chapter 8. Separate Prisons. 3 days had passed since her return, and Aurelia hadn't left her childhood bedroom. The Montclair mansion felt like a mausoleum after the warmth of Lysander's small apartment. She stood at the window, looking out at manicured gardens that suddenly seemed sterile and lifeless. Her phone sat silent on the nightstand, returned after months of confiscation, hundreds of missed calls and messages from her old world, people who had no idea what she'd experienced or lost. The thought of resuming that life felt impossible. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She expected Maria with another untouched meal, but instead Victor Ashworth entered, looking exactly as she remembered, polished, cold, calculating. But everything had changed. She had changed fundamentally and irrevocably. 3 months of living as Leah Morgan had shown her what love could feel like, what home could mean, what it was like to be valued for who you were rather than what you could provide. Going back to her old life felt like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit. She pulled Wren's drawing from the pocket of her robe. She'd been carrying it constantly, like a talisman, and smoothed it out on her bed. The simple stick figures holding hands in front of their little house looked impossibly precious against the silk bedspread that cost more than most people made in a year. "My family," Wren had written at the top, and Aurelia traced the letters with her finger, wondering if the little girl was still asking when Mama Leah was coming home. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Maria with another untouched lunch tray. Instead, Victor Ashworth stepped into her room, looking exactly as she remembered. Tall, conventionally handsome, and calculating. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit expensive and tailored, his smile practiced and empty. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. "Hello, darling," he said, as if she hadn't disappeared for 3 months. "I thought we should discuss our upcoming nuptials." "I told you before, Victor, I won't marry you," Aurelia said, not bothering to hide her distaste. "Circumstances have changed," Victor replied smoothly, settling into the velvet chair by her window without invitation. "Your little escapade has been quite educational, I'm sure, but it's time to return to reality." "It wasn't an adventure," she said quietly. "It was the first time in my life I felt like I was actually living." Victor's laugh was perfectly modulated, the kind of sound that might charm investors or impress clients but held no genuine warmth. "Playing house with a carpenter and his child. Really, Aurelia, I credited you with more imagination than that." "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't you dare diminish what they mean to me." What they meant, Victor corrected. Past tense. That chapter of your life is closed, and it's time to focus on our future together. Aurelia looked at him, really looked at him, and tried to imagine spending the rest of her life waking up next to this man who saw her as an acquisition rather than a person. The thought made her stomach turn. "I won't marry you, Victor," she said clearly. "I've told you that before, and nothing has changed." "Everything has changed," Victor replied smoothly. 3 months ago, you were a sheltered heiress with romantic notions about love and independence. Now you're a woman who's experienced the real world and learned that fairy tales don't exist. You've seen what life is like without the protections and privileges your family provides, and you've chosen to come home. "I didn't choose anything," Aurelia said. "I was forced to come home." "Semantics," Victor said with a dismissive wave. "The point is, you're here, and you're going to marry me in 3 weeks' time. Your father has been quite clear about the consequences of any further rebellion." Aurelia thought about the threats Maximilian had made in the clearing, lawsuits that would destroy Lysander's business, custody battles that could take Wren away from the only parent she had left. Even if she could find a way to go back, her presence would only bring danger to the people she loved. "The wedding preparations are already underway," Victor continued. "Your dress is being altered, the caterers are confirmed, and I've made it clear to your father that any further delays would be inconvenient for everyone involved." "What does that mean?" "It means I have extensive documentation of your carpenter friend's tax situation. Small business owners often make innocent mistakes with their filings. It would be unfortunate if the IRS decided to audit him thoroughly. And custody evaluations can be so unpredictable when there are questions about a parent's financial stability and lifestyle choices." Victor's smile was perfectly pleasant as he delivered the threats. "Of course, none of that will be necessary once we're married. I have no interest in vindictiveness. I simply want what's mine." The threat was delivered in the same tone Victor might use to discuss the weather, and that casual cruelty told Aurelia everything she needed to know about the kind of man she was expected to marry. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, Lysander was discovering that heartbreak was a physical thing that made it hard to breathe and impossible to sleep. He'd thrown himself into work with desperate intensity, taking on more restoration projects than he could reasonably handle, staying in the workshop until exhaustion forced him to stumble upstairs to his empty apartment. But even work couldn't quiet the questions that plagued him. How much of what he'd experienced with Leah, with Aurelia, had been real? When she'd laughed at his jokes, when she'd helped with Wren's homework, when she'd stayed up all night during Wren's fever, had any of it been genuine? Or had it all been an elaborate performance by a bored heiress, slumming it with the common folk? The worst part was Wren. His daughter had stopped drawing entirely, spending her afternoons sitting by the window, watching for a car that wasn't coming. She asked about Mama Leah constantly, when she was coming back, whether she was sick, if they'd done something wrong to make her leave. "She didn't leave because of us, sweetheart," Lysander had tried to explain. "Sometimes adults have complicated lives that make it impossible for them to stay where they want to be." "But she said she loved us," Wren had replied with 8-year-old logic. "If she loved us, why didn't she tell us her real name?" It was a question Lysander couldn't answer because he was struggling with the same confusion. How could someone lie so completely about who they were, while still somehow making him feel more loved and understood than he'd ever felt in his life? He'd Googled Aurelia Montclair 3 days after she'd been taken away, and the search results had been overwhelming. Photos of her at charity galas, society pages documenting her education at exclusive schools, business articles about her father's empire and her role as his heir. She was everything he'd never imagined himself being involved with. Wealthy beyond comprehension, sophisticated in ways that made his simple life seem quaint by comparison. The woman in those photos looked like Leah, but somehow different, more polished, more remote, her smiles perfectly calculated for cameras. Looking at them, he could almost convince himself that the woman who'd made pancakes in his kitchen and fallen asleep reading to his daughter had been someone else entirely. But then he'd remember the way she'd looked at Wren during the fever, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes. He'd remember how she talked about feeling peaceful for the first time in her life, the tears in her eyes when she'd said she couldn't imagine living without them. Those moments felt real in a way that couldn't be faked, which meant that Aurelia Montclair, for all her wealth and sophistication, had been as lost and lonely as he'd been before they found each other. The realization didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it made it more complicated. Because if her feelings had been real, if she truly loved them as much as she'd claimed, then she was probably suffering just as much as they were. As another sleepless night stretched before him, Lysander found himself wondering if love could survive the kind of deception they'd built their relationship on. He'd been so angry in the clearing, so focused on the lies that he'd barely listened to her explanations. But now, in the quiet darkness of his apartment, he found himself wishing he'd asked different questions. Not whether her name was real, but whether her love was. Not whether her background was true, but whether her tears when she'd said goodbye to Wren had been genuine. Not whether she'd lied about her past, but whether she'd been honest about the future she'd wanted with them. 3 weeks until her wedding, according to the society pages, he couldn't stop himself from reading. 3 weeks until Aurelia Montclair married someone else and disappeared from their lives forever. The thought made him feel like he was drowning, but he didn't know how to reach for the surface when he wasn't even sure which way was up anymore. Chapter 9. The Heart's Rebellion. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline October light that made everything look sharp and unforgiving. Aurelia stood at the window of her bridal suite, watching as workers put the finishing touches on the elaborate outdoor ceremony setup. 300 guests would soon fill the gilt chairs arranged on the mansion's perfectly manicured lawn, and a string quartet was already tuning their instruments beneath the flower-draped gazebo, where she would promise to love, honor, and obey a man she despised. Her wedding dress hung behind her, $30,000 of French silk and Venetian lace that had been featured in 3 different bridal magazines. It was, everyone assured her, the most beautiful gown they'd ever seen. Aurelia thought it looked like an expensive shroud. "You look like you're about to bolt," said a voice from the doorway. Aurelia turned to see her cousin Charlotte entering the suite, already dressed in her bridesmaid's gown. Charlotte was one of the few people in their extended family who had ever spoken honestly to Aurelia. Perhaps it was because she'd inherited independently from her mother's side, and didn't need to worry about Maximilian's approval. "The thought has crossed my mind," Aurelia admitted. "Good," Charlotte said, settling into one of the silk-upholstered chairs. "For a minute there, I was worried you'd actually go through with this farce. You know I don't have a choice." "Everyone has choices," Charlotte said firmly. "Some are just harder than others." "And look how that ended," Aurelia said bitterly. "With innocent people getting hurt because of my selfishness." Charlotte was quiet for a moment, studying her cousin's face. "The carpenter," she said finally. "You really fell in love with him." It wasn't a question, and Aurelia didn't try to deny it. With him and with his daughter. With the life we were building together. "So why are you here instead of there?" "Because I lied to them about everything that mattered," Aurelia said. "Because when they found out who I really was, they looked at me like I was a stranger. Because my being there would only bring them trouble they don't deserve. Or because you're a coward who's choosing the easy path instead of fighting for what you want." The words hit like a slap, and Aurelia whirled around to face her cousin. "Easy? You think this is easy?" "I think marrying Victor is easier than telling the man you love the truth and begging him to forgive you," Charlotte said calmly. I think playing the dutiful daughter is easier than standing up to Uncle Max and risking his disapproval. I think living a lie is easier than fighting for the right to live authentically. You don't understand the complications. I understand that you've spent your entire life doing what other people expected instead of what you wanted, Charlotte interrupted. And I understand that you found something real with these people, something that made you happy in a way you'd never been before. The question is whether you're brave enough to fight for it. Before Aurelia could respond, the door opened again and Maria entered with a tray of champagne. For the bride and her attendants, Maria said, but her smile was strained. The older woman had been with the Montclair family for over 20 years, and she'd watched Aurelia grow from a lonely child into an even lonelier adult. Your father requests that you be ready for photographs in 30 minutes. After Maria left, Charlotte handed Aurelia a champagne flute. To making the right choice, she said, even when it's the hard one. Aurelia took the glass but didn't drink. Instead, she found herself thinking about Wren's drawing, still folded carefully in her jewelry box. In 2 hours, she would become Mrs. Victor Ashworth, and that little girl who had called her Mama would become nothing more than a bittersweet memory. Tell me about them, Charlotte said quietly. Tell me about the life you built. So Aurelia did. She told her cousin about Lysander's patient hands as he taught her to sandwood, about the smell of sawdust and coffee that meant home. She told her about Wren's midnight fever and the fierce protectiveness that had awakened in her, about reading bedtime stories and helping with homework and feeling needed in a way that had nothing to do with her bank account. He proposed, she said finally, her voice breaking slightly. The night my father found us, he'd strung lights in our favorite spot and gotten down on one knee with his grandmother's ring. And they're here, Charlotte said quietly. What? In the guest cottage. I invited them yesterday. Charlotte's smile was mischievous but determined. I figured if you were going to make the biggest decision of your life, you should at least have all your options present. The question hung in the air as another knock came at the door. This time it was Maximilian himself, resplendent in his morning coat and looking every inch the proud father of the bride. Aurelia, he said, his voice warm with satisfaction. You look beautiful, exactly as a Montclair bride should. Thank you, she said automatically. The guests are beginning to arrive, he continued. The governor and his wife are here, along with several senators and that lovely ambassador from France. Victor's family is positively glowing with pride. Charlotte excused herself, claiming she needed to check on the other bridesmaids, but Aurelia caught the meaningful look her cousin gave her before leaving. I hope you're pleased with how everything has turned out, Maximilian said, moving to straighten Aurelia's veil. This union will secure our family's position for generations to come. And if I'm miserable, you'll adjust, he said with the casual dismissal of someone who had never prioritized happiness over duty. Marriage is a partnership, Aurelia, not a romance novel. You and Victor will build something substantial together. Looking at her father, Aurelia realized that he genuinely believed what he was saying. In his world, love was a luxury that wealthy people couldn't afford, and happiness was less important than stability. He'd married her mother for similar reasons, and if their union had been cold and distant, at least it had been profitable. I should finish getting ready, she said. Of course, Maximilian said, kissing her forehead with what probably passed for affection in his emotional vocabulary. I'll see you at the altar, my dear. Alone again, Aurelia stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her was everything a society bride should be. Beautiful, elegant, perfectly composed. But her eyes were dead, and her smile looked painted on. She thought about Lysander's face when he'd proposed, the hope and love shining in his green eyes. She thought about Wren asking if they were going to be a real family now. She thought about the life they'd been building together, imperfect and complicated, but real in a way this gilded cage had never been. 30 minutes later, as the string quartet began the processional music, Aurelia made her way down the grand staircase on her father's arm. 300 guests rose to their feet, cameras flashed, and the autumn breeze lifted her veil like a banner behind her. At the altar, Victor waited with the satisfied smile of a man claiming his prize. The minister opened his book and began the ceremony that would bind her to a future she'd never chosen. "Dearly beloved," he intoned, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Victor Ashworth and Aurelia Montclair." The words washed over her like white noise as she stood frozen in the midst of her own life, watching it unfold like a movie she wasn't starring in. This was her moment to speak up, to object to her own wedding, to choose love over duty. But the weight of expectation, of 300 pairs of eyes, of her father's threats against the people she loved, held her in place like chains. "Do you, Victor, take Aurelia to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the minister asked. "I do," Victor said, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "And do you, Aurelia, take Victor to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" This was it, the moment when she would seal her fate forever, when she would choose safety over authenticity, duty over love. Aurelia opened her mouth to speak the words that would end her story with Lysander and Wren forever. And then she heard it, a child's voice calling from somewhere in the crowd of guests. "Mama Leah!" Her heart stopped. It couldn't be. But she turned toward the sound anyway, and there, among the wedding guests near the back, stood Lysander and Wren. They were dressed nicely but simply, clearly out of place among the wealthy attendees. Later, she would learn that Charlotte had sent them invitations, that her cousin had been quietly orchestrating this moment for weeks. But right now, all Aurelia could see was the man she loved, and the little girl who had called her Mama, standing at the edge of her wedding like a vision of the life she'd abandoned. "Mama Leah," Wren called again, and this time her voice carried across the entire gathering. 300 guests turned to stare, murmurs rippling through the crowd like waves. Maximilian's face had gone thunderous, and Victor's smile had frozen into something that looked more like a snarl. But all Aurelia could see was the man she loved, and the little girl who had called her Mama, standing at the edge of her wedding like a vision of the life she'd given up. The minister cleared his throat. "Miss Montclair, do you take this man to be your husband?" Aurelia looked at Victor, at her father, at the sea of expectant faces surrounding her. Then she looked back at Lysander and Wren, at the future she'd thought was lost forever. And suddenly, she knew what her answer had to be. "No," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I don't." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible, but Aurelia was already moving, gathering up her silk skirts and running toward the only family she'd ever really wanted. Chapter 10. Building Forever. Aurelia ran across the manicured lawn in her wedding dress, $30,000 of silk and lace trailing behind her like a banner of rebellion. The shocked murmurs of 300 guests faded into background noise as she focused on the two figures standing at the edge of the chaos she'd just created. "Wren!" she called out, and the little girl broke free from her father's hand to run toward her. They collided in the middle of the lawn, Aurelia dropping to her knees to catch Wren in her arms. The little girl was crying and laughing at the same time, her small hands touching Aurelia's face as if to make sure she was real. "I knew you'd come back," Wren said through her tears. "I knew Mama Leah wouldn't leave us forever." "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Aurelia whispered, holding her tight. "I'm so sorry I hurt you. Miss Montclair." Victor's voice cut through the moment like a blade. He was striding toward them, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. What exactly do you think you're doing? Aurelia stood slowly, keeping Wren close to her side, and turned to face the man she'd just left at the altar. Behind him, she could see her father pushing through the crowd of guests, security men flanking him. "I'm choosing my family," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the lawn. "Your family." Victor's laugh was sharp and cold. "A carpenter and his bastard child? You're throwing away everything for that?" The word bastard hung in the air like poison, and Aurelia felt Wren flinch against her side. In that moment, something crystallized inside her, a fierce, protective fury that burned away the last of her fear. "Don't you ever," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "speak about my daughter that way again." "Your daughter?" Victor's eyebrows rose. "You've been gone for 3 months, and you think that gives you some claim to—" "It gives her every claim." Lysander's voice was calm, but carried an authority that made Victor step back involuntarily. He'd been watching the exchange from a few feet away, and now he moved to stand beside Aurelia and Wren, his presence both solid and comforting. "Wren is my daughter by blood," Lysander continued, "but Aurelia became her mother the night she stayed up taking care of her during a fever. She became her mother when she read bedtime stories and helped with homework and made her feel safe and loved. Biology is just science. Family is choice." Maximilian had reached them now, flanked by security, and radiating the kind of cold rage that made corporate executives and government officials scramble to appease him. "Aurelia," he said, his voice deadly calm, "you will return to the altar and complete this ceremony. Now." "No," she said simply. "Yes, you will. Because if you don't, I will destroy these people so thoroughly that—" "That what?" Aurelia interrupted, stepping forward. "That you'll ruin a good man's business? That you'll try to take a little girl away from the only parent she has left? That you'll use your wealth and power to crush anyone who dares to make me happy? If necessary, yes." The casual cruelty in his voice was stunning, but it also freed something inside Aurelia. Because this was who her father really was, who he'd always been. A man who saw people as chess pieces and love as weakness. "Then we'll have to do it without my cooperation," she said, "and without my inheritance, which I hereby renounce. I'm done being your pawn, and I'm done sacrificing my happiness for your empire." "You're being emotional and irrational," Maximilian said dismissively. "Think about what you're giving up, your entire future, your security, everything this family has built." "I'm not giving up my future," Aurelia said, looking at Lysander and Wren. "I'm finally choosing it for myself. The legal complications would be enormous, trust funds to unravel, inheritance clauses to challenge, business partnerships to dissolve. But Charlotte had quietly been helping her understand her options for months, and Aurelia was prepared for the battle ahead. "Miss Montclair." The voice belonged to Detective Harrison, a local police officer who'd apparently been summoned to deal with the situation. "Is there a problem here?" Aurelia looked at the detective, then at her father's security team, then at the crowd of wedding guests who were watching the drama unfold like spectators at a particularly entertaining theater production. "No problem, detective," she said clearly. "I've simply decided not to marry Mr. Ashworth after all." "You can't just—" Victor began, but the detective held up a hand. "Actually, sir, she can. Last I checked, forced marriage was still illegal in this state." The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Maximilian's own legal connections were now protecting his daughter's right to refuse the marriage he'd arranged. "This is far from over," Maximilian said, his voice promising retribution. "You think you can just walk away from your responsibilities, from everything this family has built?" "I think I can walk away from a life that was never really mine," Aurelia said. "And I think I can build something real with people who love me for who I am, not what I can provide." She turned to Lysander, who had been silent during the confrontation, and for the first time since she'd run from the altar, she felt uncertainty creep in. His face was unreadable, and she realized that just because she'd chosen them didn't mean they were ready to forgive her deception. "Lysander," she said quietly, "I know I don't have the right to ask, but—" "Why did you come back?" he asked, and she could hear the pain that was still raw in his voice. The question stopped her cold, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the truth was so simple and so complicated at the same time. "Because living without you and Ren isn't living at all," she said. "Because even if you can never forgive me for lying to you, I couldn't marry someone else while my heart belongs to both of you. Because I realize that being Aurelia Montclair means nothing if I can't also be the woman who fell in love with the carpenter and his daughter." "You broke our hearts," Lysander said quietly. "I know," Aurelia whispered. "I broke my own heart, too." They stood facing each other across the wreckage of her former life, with Ren between them holding both their hands, while 300 wedding guests watched and waited. "The question is," Lysander said finally, "what do we do now?" "Now," said Charlotte, appearing suddenly beside them with a mischievous smile, "you get out of here before Uncle Max calls in more security." She was holding car keys and a small suitcase that Aurelia recognized as her own overnight bag. "I took the liberty of packing a few things," Charlotte explained. "The practical clothes, not the designer ones. I figured you'd want to be comfortable for whatever comes next." "Charlotte, you can't," Aurelia began. "I can, and I did," her cousin interrupted. "Someone in this family needs to choose love over money. And since it's not going to be the older generation, it might as well be us." She pressed the keys into Lysander's hand. "My car's parked by the service entrance. It's not much, but it'll get you away from here." "Charlotte," Maximilian's voice was dangerous. "Uncle Max," Charlotte said cheerfully, "you can threaten to disinherit me, but I inherited my money from my mother's side, remember? Which means I'm free to help my cousin make the best decision of her life." 20 minutes later, they were driving away from the Montclair estate in Charlotte's modest sedan, Aurelia having changed out of her wedding dress and into jeans and a sweater that felt like freedom. Ren was chattering excitedly in the back seat, asking 100 questions about where they were going and whether this meant they were really a family now. "Are we really a family now?" Lysander asked quietly, echoing his daughter's question. "I'd like to be," Aurelia said, "if you'll have me. If you can forgive me for lying about who I was." "The woman I fell in love with wasn't Leah Morgan," Lysander said thoughtfully. "She was someone who made pancakes and read bedtime stories and stayed up all night taking care of a sick child. She was someone who knew more about antiques than she let on, and who looked at our simple life like it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. That woman was more real than Aurelia Montclair ever was," she said softly. "Then maybe the question isn't whether I can forgive you for lying," Lysander said, "but whether you can forgive yourself for taking so long to tell the truth." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, heading toward the small town that had become home to all of them. As they passed the familiar landmarks, the diner where Martha worked, the school where Ren drew pictures of their family, the festival grounds where they'd danced under string lights, Aurelia felt the last of her anxiety fade away. "Will you marry me?" Lysander asked suddenly, pulling over at the same clearing where he'd proposed months ago. The fairy lights were gone now, and autumn leaves covered the ground where her ring box had fallen. But it was still their place, still the spot where they'd almost begun their forever before her past caught up with them. "Are you sure?" Aurelia asked, though her heart was already singing with the knowledge that this time there would be no black SUVs, no security men, no father to drag her away. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said, pulling the same ring box from his pocket. "Aurelia Montclair, Leah Morgan, or whoever you want to be. Will you marry us?" Yes, she said, laughing through her tears as he slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger. Yes, yes, yes. Finally, Wren cheered from the back seat. Can we have the wedding in our backyard, with pancakes instead of fancy cake? Anything you want, little star, Aurelia said, turning to kiss the little girl who had called her back to the life she'd almost lost. As they sat in the clearing where their story had almost ended, Aurelia realized that sometimes the best love stories don't end with castles and crowns. Sometimes they end with a man who works with his hands, a little girl who draws pictures of home, and the courage to choose authenticity over everything else. The legal battles would continue for months. The society pages would have a field day. Maximilian would eventually come around, partly because Charlotte proved surprisingly fierce in family negotiations, and partly because even he couldn't argue with his daughter's obvious happiness. Aurelia lost access to her trust fund and inheritance, but gained something far more valuable, the right to choose her own life. She found work at the County Historical Society, using her expertise to help preserve local heritage. The pay was modest, but the satisfaction was immeasurable. This story ends with three people who found their way home to each other, proving that the greatest adventures sometimes begin with finally stopping long enough to build something real and lasting. 6 months later, they had their small wedding in the workshop, where they fell in love, surrounded by the community that had embraced them. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better. It was real,